All right. Hey guys, welcome to the first lesson of Module 2, where we are going to discuss the torso in length. Now, this part of the lesson will be the discussion lesson, and we'll basically have this for Module 2, Module 3, and Module 4, where we'll be talking about the bulk of the body itself. And what that means is that I'll just be going over everything I sort of know about anatomy and walk you through what is important to remember, what is easy to understand. Now, if you're a little bit more advanced and you don't want to go through these discussions, we have a recap of each lesson at the end of this video. So you can just skip ahead to the recap if you don't need any of the information I'll be sharing here. If you do, stick around, and each of those lessons in the beginning we'll be going through this discussion phase basically, and then we'll move on to the recap and finally your assignment. The first lesson here, what we'll be discussing is the torso and the back muscles. So the posterior chain of the muscle groups, again, just superficially. We'll start with the bones itself, which means that we'll be looking at the rib cage, in this case, the scapula, the pelvis, and the spine, because this is what mostly makes up the rib cage, especially for the posterior muscles, right? We also have the clavicle at the front that will play a huge role in the anterior muscles, the front muscles. But for this lesson, we'll be sticking to the posterior muscles. So as you can see, what we tend to see for the rib cage and the torso, just the bone structures of the torso, is we have this egg shape for the rib cage, or I'll do it here. We have the egg shape for the rib cage. We have the scapula that makes up a large portion of the shoulder joint, and that has a lot of functionality when it comes to moving the arms, keeping the arms in place. It helps us a lot with everything, basically, push-ups, pull-ups, whatever it is. So it has a big function on the body. And so it's also a big landmark when it comes to the bone structures of the body. Then we have the pelvis. And of course, you all know what the pelvis is, what it means, what it stands for. It has a huge role more in the legs, actually, the leg muscles, the bones of the legs, than it has with the muscles. But it does hold a lot of, posterior muscles as well as, of course, anterior muscles. So we'll look at that as well. And then finally, we have the spine. So one of the spine basically has four major sections. We have the cervical part of the spine. Here we have here we have the thoracic part of the spine. We have the lumbar part of the spine, and then we have the sacrum part, basically. And so what that means is that it each has their own function, where the cervical spine sits between the cranium of the head, right, and in between the scapula. And so this is a very flexible part of the spine. The thoracic part here is the one that encompasses almost the entirety of the rib cage. So it's also the most rigid, and it doesn't really move as much, but it's really there to stabilize our rib cage and hold everything in place. Then we have the lumbar part, which is also, again, a very flexible part. So everything that's not attached to the rib cage is more flexible. And this lumbar part allows us to, either twist our bodies or bend our bodies forward and keep, everything in place. And of course, it literally connects the rib cage with the pelvis. And then the sacrum wedges in between our pelvis at the rear, as you can see here, and it ends in the coccyx, which is basically our tailbone. And so those are the four major parts of the spine. From my estimate, you don't really need to remember this, but it is good to remember because it is basically present in any other mammal form as well. So lots of mammals will also have rib cages, pelvises that have a thoracic spine part, that will have a cervical spine part and a lumbar spine part. And Each of them will almost serve the same function, where there's more rigidity around the thoracic spine, a lot more flexibility around the lumbar and the cervical part. And so basically that's most of what you need to know when it comes to the bone structure. You don't have to really remember a lot when it comes to the anatomy part. It's very simple to understand. And again, what I want to stress in this, in this course is that we are trying to understand how anatomy is basically informing the manipulated shapes of our body, of our mannequin, right? And so what you need to understand is that when we talked about the three main masses in the beginning of this course, right, we were talking about those boxes that make up the body essentially, either tilted forward or backwards. Right? This is essentially what we're trying to represent. Now, of course, when we know these bone structures, we can have a better understanding of how we can create more fidelity within those simple shapes. So we're not only using boxes, we're using something that's a little bit more representative of the actual anatomy. And this is what we'll see when we look at the simplification lessons. So for each of the lessons that we have, module 2, 3, and 4, we'll be having simplification lessons where we take our anatomy knowledge and we simplify it down to manipulated forms that better represent that anatomy instead of just using simple boxes. All right? But that's something for the simplification. Now, moving on to the muscles, when we look at a orthographic view of the back muscles, we can essentially see a couple of different muscles, right? So we have the bone structure on the left here, and we have the muscle structure on the right. And superficially, we can identify around 7 muscles, right? So the first one being the trapezius. So it's indicated here in red. And the trapezius will almost make up a good of 1/3 of the back muscle. So it's a very prolific and present muscle. You will almost always see it on everybody, regardless of their muscle tone. So it's a very present muscle, and one you should definitely remember. Also, the shape is one you should definitely try to remember. It's that quintessential diamond shape. However, when we are going to look at the simplification, we're definitely going to look at how we can break up that shape to better remember what it actually looks like in space. Because it's one thing to remember these muscles from an orthographic point of view, but it's something completely different to remember their placement on the body and what their volume is like. And for me, that's a lot more important than knowing their flat placement on the body in an orthographic view, because you will never draw a body, or rarely draw one, in that manner, right? Because it'll always look flat. So you want to have your character designs, your creature designs, your whatever you want to design, even armor, right? Because a lot of armor is based on anatomy. You want it to have volume. You want it to be readable, especially if you want to be a concept designer. You want that to be readable for the 3D team or any other team. So that's important, right? Again, that's for a little bit later, but when we move on, we have the trapezius, and the trapezius has a lot of different functions, and we can almost split it in like the superior side, where the function will be more around shrugging the shoulders or twisting the neck or stabilizing the neck, whereas the lower part will have more function in contracting a lot of our, contracting the arms, moving the arms, stabilizing the back and the torso itself. So it has a lot of different functions. And if you do a little bit of training or working out, you can sort of, if you know the movements or the exercises that you need to do in order to develop these muscles, you kind of understand what their function is, because you need to actually repeat that function with either weights or without weights to train that muscle, to cause hypertrophy in that muscle, meaning to grow that muscle. So if you do a bit of training or a bit of working out, you definitely have an edge here when it comes to knowing what the function of the muscle is. Moving on, when we have the latissimus dorsi, right? So indicated here in green is the latissimus dorsi, and latissimus dorsi is a very interesting muscle. it's one that is very present both on the back as well as when we look at very muscular people from the front, right? You will see that that basically that wing under their arms, which is a lot of the times it's the latissimus dorsi peeking from the back, right? So if we have a largely developed muscle, you will see that from the front and the back. The latissimus dorsi has a couple of different functions. So it kind of works in tangent with the teres major. So the teres major is this yellow muscle over here, and they kind of work in tangent. And what they do is they help adduct or internally rotate or extend the arms. So again, they play a huge role in what our arms can do and how our arms function. And they basically help to stabilize all of that. When it comes to placement on the body, what you can see is that the latissimus dorsi will attach underneath the arm, so it will attach to the humerus because it needs to help in providing and stabilizing the arm. And then it will sort of fan out graphically. If we look at the graphic shape, it will fan out across the thoracic spine all the way down to the lumbar spine and kind of create this kind of triangular squarish shape. So it's almost like very simplified. It would look like this, right? Almost like a simplified wing. And that's what the latissimus dorsi basically is, right? And an interesting thing about it is that the bulk or the main mass or the main volume of that latissimus dorsi will sit around the lateral side of your body. So on the lateral side of your rib cage, meaning on the side, and it will fan out quite significantly and really thin out when it comes towards the posterior side of your back, and it will sort of go into tendon a lot more, become wider a lot more. Whiter, the color white, and become a lot thinner because it will basically have no volume at the back of your torso. So that's the latissimus dorsi, and then underneath that we have the erector spinae, and the erector spinae is also a very interesting muscle because first off it looks like two simple tapering cylinders. Now the thing that you should be aware of is that it doesn't, and that can be misleading because it's covered by the trapezius, but it runs all the way across the thoracic spine, right? So if I take the same color, it would run all across the thoracic spine underneath the latissimus, underneath the trapezius, sorry. Right? So don't be misled by that because it plays a huge role in straightening the back and providing stabilization with side-to-side rotation. So although it's hidden beneath the trapezius, the erector spinae actually runs all the way through. So keep that in mind. And when it comes to simple form, of course, it just is basically two cylinders, right? It's two tapering cylinders. So instead of it being just a cylinder like this, what it actually does is it tapers like really narrow on top, and then it kind of fans out like this, right, in an exaggerated form. But that's basically what the erector spinae looks like in a simplified form, and where you will find it on the body. So it will be here in between. So you will see it poke through the trapezius, overlap the latissimus dorsi, and wedge in between the sacrum, right? And that it's also the thing that will help, along with the glutes, of course. It will help you give that one of the landmarks on the body, which is the sacral triangle, which is this triangle. Right? It will wedge in between there. Right? So that's it for the erector spinae. We also have the external obliques on the back, which are these guys, these fellas. And of course, the external obliques, from a simplified point of view, and this is a little bit on the back, they also look like simple triangles. And if you want to remember that way, fine. I like to remember them a little bit more volumetrically, again with that simplified form, just as being S-curves that sit on the oblique. Like this. And we will have a very well drawn simplified form by Axel in the simplification lesson. But for me, they look a little bit more like this. If you want to remember them like that, this is a very Michael Hampton way of remembering them. I think when Axel simplified them, he takes the simplified cylinder of the body, of the abdomen, and then he kind of adds this simple sheet on top of them. So it's up to you how you want to remember that form in its volume, but I definitely, again, advise you to remember the volume and not just the simple orthographic representation, because that will not serve you any well when it comes to drawing characters from imagination. You want to be able to understand the volume itself. What the external obliques help do is they help with flexing, twisting, and rotating the trunk. Right, so basically your trunk, the torso that you have, your rib cage, and your abdomen, when you want to twist that, they help with stabilizing that and twisting and rotating. It's quite a significant muscle as well. Reason it's also significant is it will help provide in establishing the silhouette of the body. So we will talk about a lot of that in the simplification video. But again, the obliques, remember, they sit, on top of the pelvis. They sit at the side of the body. You will also see them from the back, so they will make up the muscle groups on the posterior side. They are the oblique muscles that sit around the abdomen, and they basically sit in between the latissimus and the glute muscles, and they will help with stabilizing the trunk. And then lastly, the one that I have not discussed, the deltoid, but we will discuss that in a different lesson. And we have the infraspinatus. So the infraspinatus here is a muscle that covers the scapula itself. It also helps a lot with stabilization and protraction or retraction of the arms. But the only thing from my point of view that you need to remember is that this muscle sits on top of the scapula. It's the infraspinatus. You also have the supraspinatus, which is the muscle that sits on top of the spine of the scapula. So that's why it's called infra and supraspinatus. One sits on top, one sits at the bottom. So if you have the scapula, like you see here, we have the spine, right? And then the infraspinatum muscle kind of runs across like that. And the supraspinatus sits somewhere around here. And these muscles make up the rotator cuff. So along with the teres major, they make up the rotator cuff muscle, which is a muscle group that is largely responsible for a lot of the functionalities around the shoulder joint. So the deltoid covers a lot of what we do with our shoulder, of course, but the rotator cuff helps a lot with stabilization and internally or externally rotating our arms. So it plays a huge role, and a lot of injuries when it comes to people that do a lot of gymnastics or that do a lot of body heavy or torso heavy sports, they are susceptible to a lot of injury of the rotator cuff because it's a less developed muscle. And especially people that get into bodybuilding early on and they overtrain their deltoid muscle, they will undertrain their rotator cuff, and that will create a weakness in that rotator cuff, and that will also cause injury. So it's not a super important detail for you to remember, but what you do need to remember is that the infraspinator, teres major, and the supraspinatus, which is not indicated here, make up the rotator cuff. That's just maybe a piece of trivia for you to remember. Again, the most important thing, and the reason why we only include the infraspinatus in this lesson, is because it might be a muscle that you see on very well-developed bodies, but rarely when skin is applied on top, you will rarely see this muscle. But it's one that you definitely can remember if you want to. Again, the purpose of this course for us, for us at ArtWad is for you to get a better understanding of why we manipulate the mannequin in such a way that we do. A rough understanding of anatomy is more than enough. We'll go into a little bit more detail. We'll talk about all the superficial muscle groups, but for us, the most important part is that you remember the volume of these muscles and where they sit on the body and how you can draw them in space, because that's what will help you a lot more than anything else. All right, so to recap, we have the trapezius on top, which is this very diamond-shaped muscle. Right? If I encompass the silhouette, it's a very diamond-shaped. Then we have the latissimus dorsi, that is the second largest, or at least equally large muscle that sits underneath there. That's also kind of like this wing structure or simplified box structure on both sides. Right? We have the obliques that sit in between, which you can almost always see as like an inverted triangular box. And then in between that sits the erector spinae muscles that actually run all the way across, right? And then we have those rotator cuff muscles on the scapula. So those are those main muscle groups we want you to remember for the back muscles. And we want you to learn as well. And those are the ones you'll be indicating in the assignment as well, right? And then when we move on to form, and so this is something important that I want to definitely put your attention to, is it's the forms that are important, right? And so Axel did a beautiful job of kind of representing how you can think about these individual forms. And we're not going to concern ourselves too much with the deltoid just yet, because that's something we discuss in the arm lesson. But keep in mind, we want to be able to simplify this one as well. But if we look at the trapezius, right, that diamond-shaped muscle, a lot of you, what you will do wrong is when you need to draw this in space, in a certain angle, you will again just draw that very simple graphic shape, right? And then just fill that in and be like, there, I know my anatomy. And that's where we want to kind of make the difference here at ArtWad, because it's not about understanding that orthographic view, like I told you. It's a lot more about understanding the simple manipulated volume that muscle represents. And so as you can see, what Lex did here beautifully is he kind of represented what the simplified version of that muscle would look like, right? And so this is what you would need to grasp. And this is something we cover in the beginner course. So if this is hard for you to do, again, we would first recommend that you run through the beginner course again on form manipulation. But once you're able to do that form manipulation, we can sort of see that the trapezius has this sort of tapering cylinder, right, that has a manipulated contour here and there. Sometimes it's a bit more squarish, and then it rounds off a little bit more. And we have this more triangular piece, again, with its volumes. So Axel kind of divides this in 3 pieces. I would do it in 2, where you have the trapezius, the superior part, and the inferior part, basically. And then when we look at the infraspinatus, similar thing, right? So it's not just a flat piece. It definitely has depth. So it's more, again, this inverted triangle, but it has an underside as well, right? So it definitely has its volume. Same for the latissimus dorsi, although it's a little bit harder to put that into one big volume. What's important for you to understand is that it sort of fans out and also wraps around the rib cage, right? So it will take up a large mass around the rib cage, and it will definitely turn. Now, it will turn maybe a little bit softer than what Axel has drawn here, but in order to understand that the rib cage sits underneath, we kind of exaggerate that a little bit. But keep in mind that the bulk of our volume will sit here on the latissimus dorsi, right? And then for the erector spinae, these are just basically simple tapering cylinders, right? That will wedge in between the sacrum. But keep in mind that you would need to understand their volume. And as you can see here, what I told you about the obliques being almost like sheets with an S-curve, this is what you can see here beautifully illustrated, right? So it's that boxy sheath that would attach on the side of the body. And again, it has that volume. So it's important for you to understand these simple volumetric representations of the body, because when you look at a shaded version of the muscle, right, there's usually three major muscle groups that we can spot on the back, and it's the trapezius, the latissimus dorsi, and the erector spinae, right? These are those very important, of course, the deltoid as well, but we're not covering that in this lesson. But these are those major muscle groups that, especially on very well-defined bodies, very muscular bodies, but also when you want to do creatures or when you want to draw someone like the Hulk, right? These are muscle groups that you want to exaggerate, that you want to manipulate as well. So it's these superficial muscle groups that we'll see even when the skin is applied on top, they will still shine through. And so that's important for you to remember. And that's why understanding this and applying it here will give you an easier time also shading your anatomy, especially from imagination, right? So keep that in mind when you're learning this, when you're drawing this. And it's also what we will do in the assignment, right? But keep that in mind, okay? So as you can see here as well, we again see this is a simple shaded version of a back, skin applied on top. This is a very well-defined, person. But again, we can see primarily that trapezius. We can see the latissimus dorsi working in tangent actually with the teres major, and we see some of that infraspinatus here as well, right? But we can see the latissimus dorsi, and then we can see the rib cage, right? So we have that volumetric, bulk of the latissimus dorsi that is still muscle. That's also what you will see shine through on the front side of the body, but then it sort of fans out, and we just see more of the rib cage. Right? And we see more of that bone structure. And then we have the erector spinae as well, almost always very clearly defined on our back. Okay? So that's sort of what I wanted to discuss for this lesson. We have a recap of this with some more imagery attached. So be sure to watch that after this discussion video, and then we'll move into the assignments. All right? Have fun, everyone. Hey, athletes. Welcome to lesson 1 of module 2. This lesson will be focusing on the posterior side of the torso. So that means the back side. So the torso covers two main masses of the body, the rib cage and the pelvis. Overall, 4 main bone structures will make up the torso from the back. We have the rib cage, the scapula bones, the pelvis, and the spine. When looking at these structures individually, we can see how each can be broken down into a unique, simplified form. The rib cage represents a simple egg shape with a triangular shape subtracted at the bottom. The spine represents a simple tapering cylinder with a subtle S-curve. The spine also becomes wider at the base and ends in the sacrum, a triangular base wedged into the pelvis. The pelvis itself, although appearing very complex, is easier to understand when represented as a simple bucket, a sort of hollowed out half sphere with a flattened bottom. The scapula bones look very complex, primarily due to the scapular spine and the acromion attached to it. However, a simplified triangular box suffices to understand its orientation in space and positioning on the body. Interesting to note here is that the spine has 4 major sections. We have the cervical spine, which we covered in the neck lesson, going from the base of the cranium to in between your scapula. Then we have the thoracic spine that covers the top and bottom of the rib cage, the lumbar spine that sits in between the rib cage and the pelvis, and finally we have the sacrum. Keep in mind that the cervical and lumbar spine, essentially the parts of the spine that do not cover the rib cage, are the most flexible and provide most mobility. The thoracic spine will not bend very much as it provides stability to the ribcage. Lastly, keep in mind that these bone structures indicate why we draw the three main masses in this kind of offset manner, like we discussed in lesson 1 of this course. As you can see, the ribcage tilts slightly backwards while the pelvis tilts forwards in a neutral standing position. Knowing these four main bone structures, and especially their manipulated form, is more than enough to understand the placement of muscle on top of them. Looking at an orthographic view of the back, we can identify 7 superficial muscle groups. Anatomically, there are many more, but as artists, these superficial ones are the most important ones to remember, since it's these muscles that we can see during live drawing, or it's these muscles that we manipulate when designing from imagination. When we look at this from top to bottom, we see the trapezius on top, a sort of large diamond-shaped muscle that covers a large chunk of the back. Then we have the deltoid muscles that connect between the scapula bone, the clavicle, and the humerus. Next is the infraspinatus muscle that covers a large portion of the scapula bone, the teres major muscle that works with the latissimus dorsi to stabilize the humerus and scapula, and of course the latissimus dorsi itself, a rather thin muscle that connects underneath the humerus and attaches to a large part of the thoracic and lumbar part of the spine. Next, we have the external obliques that sit on top of the pelvis, or more specifically, the iliac spine of the pelvis. And we have the erector spinae muscles that stabilize our lumbar spine. Naming these muscles will get you bragging points, but it will certainly not make you a better designer. Therefore, as already stated in this course, we will focus on the 3D form this muscle represents and its function to the body. When we look at the first muscle, the trapezius, when it comes to form and function, the trapezius overall looks like a diamond shape. Yet we find it easier to subdivide this into 2 main sections. We have the tapering cylinder that connects from the cranium to the acromion, and the triangular box that sits between the scapula bones. This form is simply mirrored to the other side to form that diamond shape. Now, when we look at it functionally, we can see that the trapezius acts to stabilize the scapula. The upper or superior part of the trapezius helps in elevating the shoulders, known as shrugging. It also provides us the ability to tilt our head backwards or sideways. The lower part of the trapezius has many functions related to the scapula. It helps us with the elevation of the scapula by extending the arm. It helps us to retract our scapula backwards, or it helps us to depress the scapula, which is something that happens when we lift ourselves out of a chair, for instance. The teres major and the latissimus dorsi work in tangent to help the arm adduct, internally rotate, or extend. Looking at the form, the latissimus dorsi can take on many shapes when flexing or extending. Generally, however, this muscle has a more triangular shape with more volume and mass underneath the arm than close to the spine. The external obliques almost look like thick sheets that have a slight S-curve. They can be interpreted as bended boxes that sit on top of the pelvis. The external obliques help with flexing, twisting, and rotating the trunk. Lastly, the erector spinae are like 2 tapering cylinders in form. Their function is to straighten the back and provide stabilization with side-to-side rotation. Although hidden beneath the trapezius, the erector spinae actually runs all the way across the lumbar and thoracic spine. When we look at the shaded version of the back muscles, we usually spot 3 major muscle groups on the back: the trapezius, the latissimus dorsi, and the erector spinae. Smaller muscles like the teres major or infraspinatus will usually remain invisible underneath the skin. So overall, your main focus of these muscles, along with most of the muscles we'll discuss in this course, is to understand their basic form and volume along with their placement on the body. Now, to practice this, we want you to do the following assignments. You will trace over 10 of the images we provide in this lesson, clearly indicating where the muscles sit on the body and what their volume is. Lastly, you will add the back muscles, as discussed in this lesson, on top of 3 of the skeletal images provided in this lesson. It is important that you do this from imagination to see if you are aware of the muscles' placement and their form. All right, that's it, Artleets. We hope you have fun, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.